Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Adrian Pandev, business and immigration attorney, and today we're going to talk about the differences between the E-2 non-immigrant visa and the EB-5 permanent residence category. So the reason I'm shooting this video is because generally speaking, many people have heard of EB-5. They Google investing in the US, visa for investors, and EB-5 is the one that generally pops up. And the E-2 is often overlooked. And then very often in consultations or prospective clients reaching out, I noticed that the various different requirements for the two are conflated. And I think it's super important if you're considering moving to the US or starting a business in the US through investment. These are arguably the two main categories that you're going to deal with. With that being said, let's jump into the differences. So first, the E-2 is a non-immigrant temporary visa. So what that means is the visa will be issued for a certain validity period. It could range from a few months to 5 years is the maximum. During that period, you can enter the US and you can work for your E-2 enterprise. But once that period comes to an end, you're expected to either leave the US or renew the visa again. So the best way to think about it is the E-2 is a visa, it's temporary, and it doesn't allow you to just enter and live in the US freely. Contrast that with the EB-5, which is a permanent residence category. If you obtain an EB-5 green card, EB-5 permanent residence, right? You're able to freely live in the US. You don't have to renew the green card routinely. There is a removal of conditions part of the EB-5 process, but once you remove those conditions and you're an EB-5 green card holder, there are no more filings you have to make. After 5 years of being a permanent resident, you can decide whether you want to become a US citizen, but other than that, you can freely live in the US in any state, you can work freely. So the bottom line is huge difference in the type of immigration benefit you're applying for, right? Non-immigrant temporary visa versus permanent residence. The second big difference is basically the treaty country nationality. So what does that mean? Well, for the E-2 visa, only citizens of certain countries are eligible for the E-2 visa. So the bottom line is if you're not from one of those countries, you won't be able to qualify for an E-2 visa. I shot a separate video going over the treaty countries and that requirement. So you can, if you're wondering about this, you can watch that video for additional information. Now, sharp contrast this to EB-5, where a citizen of any country is eligible for EB-5. EB-5 is not limited to certain treaty countries or certain specific countries. There is no citizenship requirement. So what I see very often is that people from non-treaty countries are much more drawn to the EB-5 simply because the E-2 is off the table, right? So the third big difference is the minimum investment amount, and this is probably where I see the most confusion out there. So the EB-5 green card permanent residence category has a specific dollar minimum investment amount. It's $800,000 currently in a targeted employment area, or it is $1,050,000 in a non-targeted employment area. So the bottom line is there is a specific dollar amount, $800,000 or a little over $1 million related to EB-5. If you don't meet that threshold, you're not going to qualify. Sharp contrast to the E-2, which has no minimum investment amount. For E-2 purposes, your investment has to be substantial. That is what is most critical. And anyway, I shot a separate video going over what it means for the investment to be substantial because it's a bit confusing how the government determines that your investment actually qualifies. But for the purposes of this video, the difference is EB-5 specific dollar amounts, right? $800,000, $1,050,000. E-2, no specific dollar amounts. So what that means is the E-2 allows you to be significantly more creative and you're able to argue that your investment meets the criteria even if it's not a huge investment from a capital perspective, right? If the number is not very big, you could still qualify for an E-2 investment. That is impossible in EB-5 where the requirements are strict. The fourth big difference is the timeline to obtain the EB-5 green card versus the E-2 visa. So E-2 visa At some consulates can literally be processed in a matter of a few weeks. More commonly, I see a few months. But the bottom line is, all in, right, between all the planning, setting up the business, forming companies, tax strategy, etc., within a matter of a few months, you can have a full strategy, apply for the visa, and then obtain the visa. Contrast this with EB-5, where, to put it bluntly, it's going to be a multi-year process, right? Between waiting for adjudication for the petition, which takes a long time. In addition to that, you have to file for adjustment of status potentially, or an immigrant visa at a consulate. That could add additional time. Simply put, EB-5 is going to be a multi-year process. How long exactly will depend on numerous factors, but for purposes of this video, what's important to know is that the E-2 visa is going to be significantly faster, generally speaking, than an EB-5 green card. And this goes back to what I said initially about the non-immigrant versus permanent residence benefit you're getting. With EB-5, you're getting a completely different benefit than the visa, hence the faster processing. The fifth difference is employment authorization. So the bottom line here is the E-2 investor can only work for the E-2 enterprise. They cannot just seek any other job or take other jobs in the US, right? If you want to take another job, you have to structure around that, and you have to very carefully structure the business, because you're only allowed on an E-2 visa as the investor to work for that E-2 treaty enterprise, right? The EB-5 permanent residence, well, it gives you permanent residence. Now you're permanent resident. I think I said it like 3 times, but now you're permanent resident of the United States, which means you can freely work. You can have multiple jobs. You can not work. You can work for multiple companies. The bottom line is it's significantly less limiting, right? So that's something you should definitely keep in mind if you're contemplating between the two or trying to come up with a plan. The sixth big difference is the job creation requirements. So similarly to the minimum investment requirement, the EB-5 actually gives us a specific number, right? So to qualify for an EB-5 green card, you have to create 10 full-time US jobs. Now, how exactly those are counted and what qualifies as a full-time job to meet this requirement, I could shoot a separate video on that, because it just depends on several different things. But the bottom line for the purposes of this video is that for EB-5 purposes, you must create 10 jobs, full-time US jobs. Otherwise, you're not going to meet the necessary requirements. In sharp contrast to this, the E-2 visa does not have a minimum job creation requirement. You technically do not have to create any jobs and could still be eligible for an E-2 visa. Now, that being said, the E-2 does have a marginality requirement, and which basically states that you have to create, like the business, the investment has to create sufficient revenues to provide for more than the investor. So although there's no specific job creation requirement, this marginality requirement does require that the business be at least capable to hire others. Otherwise, it will be treated as marginal. So to contrast these more specifically, I think the biggest difference is in my opinion, both have a job creation requirement, although the E-2 is not specific on this. But the big difference is that the EB-5 requires the creation of 10 jobs. That's a significant amount of US employees, while the E-2 requirement of marginality can be satisfied with potentially as little as one single employee, but definitely a couple or 3, 4 employees, right? So it's significantly less of an investment on that side. Now, the seventh and final difference I'm going to go over in this video is the source of funds. And this is also a big one. I don't get a lot of questions about this, but I think on the lawyer side of these cases, I think this is arguably probably the biggest difference in a lot of ways. For EB-5 purposes, there's a massive emphasis on the source of funds. So documenting, to put it very simply, every single dollar and where it came from and how it was lawfully earned by the investor is a critical component of an EB-5 case. Now, the E-2 also has a source of funds requirement, because you have to demonstrate that your investment came from lawfully earned funds and not criminal activity. But the documentation requirement is significantly less stringent. So while it's there, it is not to the extent like with EB-5 where you literally have to account for each and every dollar and trace it back to its original source. The E-2 does not require that level of specificity. So anyway, before this video gets much longer, there's several differences. These are the main ones. If you're choosing between these two categories, my advice is to not really, I wouldn't treat them as one or the other, simply because, as I said at the beginning of this video, the E-2 is a non-immigrant temporary visa that can be obtained much faster, while the EB-5 is permanent residence, which takes much longer to obtain but gives you a lifetime benefit. So what I tell everyone is that these two immigration categories, or visa categories call it, actually are separate tools that can serve very different purposes, and potentially you may use both, which many of our clients do. But the bottom line is you should know these differences and try to understand them before you jump into this whole process. I will try to continue to shoot videos on this. There's just in this video I could think of several subtopics, but anyway, I hope you find these videos helpful. Thank you so much for watching, and if you like the videos, please click the like button and then follow the channel. Thank you so much.